Howdy folks, today we're going to be taking a look at React.lazy. What is this thing? Well, we're going to find out. Let's get started. So first of all, I just googled React.lazy and I'm going to open that up. Lazy lets you defer loading a component's code until it is rendered for the first time. Okay, so this is, I think, has to do with lazy loading, and mostly because it says lazy loading right there. So let's talk a little about what lazy loading is. React apps can get really big. Like, it is not unheard of for a large React app to be 20, 30 megabytes of code. And, you know, part of that's because we just write a lot of code and people don't really optimize that well. We can use stuff like uglify and minify, which really shrinks all your code, but it's just a lot of code. And if that's not cached, which if you've got a website that updates frequently, it won't be, that all has to download. Now, there's a really important thing in websites which is called time to first paint, and that is how long does it take from when the user basically goes to your application or makes a request to your application to the time that something appears on the screen. And a lazy load really helps improve that because it means you're downloading less code. The more code you have to download, all that code has to be downloaded and processed by the browser before any rendering can occur. This is why some applications start off with like a loading spinner, so that they have time to first paint is a lot less. Now imagine if you have an application with 40,000 components, which is not unheard of. In fact, that might be kind of average for a big application. You're not going to use all of those immediately. In fact, you're probably going to be showing your user the main home page, and they're not even going to be seeing 90% of those components. So the idea behind lazy loading is, like it says kind of here, defer loading code until it is rendered for the first time. So how that works is when React actually goes to start rendering a component, if it doesn't actually have access to that code, it's going to say, okay, let me go and fetch that now from the server. That's a very small file. It's probably 2 to 3K, usually, kbytes. And that means the browser is going to process that very quickly. The first time you load that particular component, you might see a delay. There might be a delay because it's having to fetch all these components that it needs to lazy load. But the idea is, if the user probably is not going to, on an average load, the user is not going to use 75% of your application. So it's better to make that 75% just not loaded and give them a little bit of slowness when they are trying to load pieces of the application. Now, with the way this is set up, you can do things like, oh, we know this component's critical and it's used everywhere, so you just don't lazy load it. And then that's pretty easy with that, and then that will be part of the main bundle. So yeah, let's see how they do that. This looks like a pretty short page, so this might be a pretty short video. Okay, lazy. Load. Okay. Call lazy outside your components to declare a lazy loaded React component. So we have import lazy from React, markdown preview equals lazy, import markdown preview. So this is not something we see very often in front-end JavaScript or in TypeScript. This is an import statement, which is more of a backend thing, isn't it? The thing is, when you do that regular import blah from file name, that is actually for your bundler. And your bundler will actually take those files, load them all into the same JavaScript bundler. You know, if you do like a chunked bundle, it'll load them into chunks, and that'll do all that work. This import is a dynamic asynchronous import, which means it's not meant to run with the bundler. This is meant to run on render of the page, or when the page is executing in the browser. So that's why it's in a function like this, and that's why you have that lazy there. This is declaring a component, but it's basically saying whenever you actually go to use this component, the first time you use it, run this function. And in this function, I'm sure you could actually put quite a few things, but we've got our import here, which is a lazy import. It's not going to actually go and fetch that code until it's run. Now, there are a couple other ways to handle this. There are actually dynamic imports that you can just run in vanilla JavaScript as well. There are also, you can use server-side rendering for this sort of thing, because that does pre-build the structure and hydrate. See the video I did on Quick for a way of how they handle that. And React has server-side rendering as well. But this is a little bit better because even with server-side rendering, unless you're doing it the way that Quick is doing it, you're not actually going to be rendering the entire application server-side. You're just rendering that initial page. So this means it's kind of works for other pages as well. Function returns a promise or other thenable. Thenables are kind of interesting. Basically, before promises were added to the JavaScript spec, they had the ability, and like Bluebird was a very popular promise library, but it was basically any function or any object that had a then method on it. A thenable, which means it can behave like a promise. Fun fact, thenables are actually something you can use async await on. I'm almost positive. Just because that's what async await is doing under the hood, is calling the .then. React will not call load until the first time you attempt to render the return component. After React first calls load, it waits for it to resolve, then renders the resolved value's default as a React component. So basically, your markdown preview would still need to be a valid React component file that then would handle all that stuff. There must be some really interesting stuff going on there, because if you are actually in this markdown preview, if you are using other components, I wonder if the bundler, and you have those bundled, I wonder if the bundler takes that into account. Like if you have imports upon imports, does it need, because it'd have to get the markdown preview JS and then figure out it has its own imports, lazy loading imports. So really, if you had a cascading tree of these, it could actually take quite a while to actually load the component if you had too many of them. So I could see that being a bit of a problem. Both the return promise and the promise resolve value will be cached, so React will not call load more than once, which makes sense because you wouldn't want it to. Returns a React component you can render in your tree, right? Because you need to be able to treat this just like a regular React component. I wonder how TypeScript works with this, because lazy really should be returning a type component the same as whatever is being exported from this file, but that seems like because of how dynamic this is, that might actually be really difficult to figure out. It's interesting. I kind of want to try that out now. When this code for those who are still loading, attempting to render it will suspend. Oh yeah. So this is, they have a specific, take a quick look at this. Suspense. So you've got your component, and then you actually have a fallback component that will render like a loading screen while that whole thing is working, which is pretty nice. This obviously is meant to work specifically with these lazy loading things, because you want to be able to display something while you're loading that code. Load refuse no parameters, right? You need to return a promise or some other thenable. Needs to eventually resolve to an object whose default property is a valid React component type, such as a function, memo, or forward ref. Fun fact though, if you really wanted to and were building a library, you could actually just kind of monkey patch your own React component at that point. Like if you make an object that looks like a React component, it should be possible to fool the render with that. So that could be kind of interesting for a dynamic component creation, since normally you couldn't dynamically create your components very easily because of the way the Babel system works. But I feel like with lazy loading here, you might be able to dynamically create a component, because that's really what it's doing, right? It's importing this stuff. Ooh, that could actually be interesting too, because this is a URL. You could actually have a server side thing that you pass some parameters into this, and it just builds you a custom component for specifically what your needs are at that particular time. That's really interesting, because you know what the user needs to see, or like what their preferences are, or certain things like that. So you might be able to just build a component on the fly on your server and then send that to the front end, because you can render JavaScript pretty easily on the server. That's really interesting. I kind of want to look into that a little bit further. Anyway, here's your fallback preview, markdown preview. So like this stuff in here doesn't get shown while markdown preview is loading, like because it would go to this fallback. Dynamic import, which might require support from your bundler or framework. Using this pattern requires the component was exported as default. So they are actually using the standard, like the default export stuff, which is a common JS thing. But then they're still using like the import, which, yeah, like they said, I know Webpack supports this. I'm almost positive Vite does as well, because it's pretty powerful. You can actually use this Dynamic imports like this are actually also useful if you have a circular dependency in your code and you really there's no way to resolve it. You can use a dynamic import because that will actually handle at compile time, or at runtime rather than compile time. Okay, they have an example here, show preview. So we have a show preview, our suspense fallback, and our markdown preview, which it's got this remarkable, which I'm not totally sure. I'm guessing that's like a, oh, it's a markdown rendering thing. That's pretty cool. Loading is just a loading spinner, and then we have our markdown preview lazy. Oh, that's pretty cool. They just have a little function here, delay for demo, which just does a timeout of 2 seconds, because otherwise it probably load a lot faster. So we show our preview, you can see that loading state, and then it gives you the preview once it's actually figured that, but the next time you do it, it comes up immediately because it's already loaded. Artificial delay, etc. Do not declare lazy components inside other components. Yeah, this makes sense. Because if you do it like this, then every time editor is re-rendered, then this whole thing gets recreated. And that is really bad. And it probably actually might even re-import this depending on how your module system is doing stuff. So you definitely want it to be outside. I would honestly put this inside the... I would actually have a specific folder for that. Like I would have markdown preview, like lazy markdown preview, and that just has this particular thing, because then you don't have to have this every single place that you need to do lazy loading. But yeah, I'm sure this is just an example, and that kind of looks like it. That's really all there is to it. It's I think this is really interesting. I don't think this is very commonly used except like through libraries, because it's probably really easy to screw it up, but definitely play around with it a little bit. See what you come up with. I'm really interested in seeing some of the things I could do with this, like for dynamic component creation. I'm kind of interested in trying that out, but yeah. Anyway, that's all for now. Have a good one, folks. We'll see you next time.